Our stock in trade is reliability and credibility. When a UN report is published, people can trust that it's not based on flawed methodology or influenced by political motivations. Member states, journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society actors rely on us for accurate and unbiased information. So when you have a tidal wave of misinformation, fiction, and falsehood that threaten to undermine the work that we do, whether it's to end nuclear testing, protect human rights, alleviate hunger and poverty, or address a global health pandemic, it chips away at the very foundation of global peace and security that we're working to cement. In his remarks to launch the Verified Initiative in May 2020, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres noted, quote, "We cannot cede our virtual spaces to those who traffic in lies, fear, and hate. Misinformation spreads online, in messaging apps, and person to person. Its creators use savvy production distribution methods, and to counter it, scientists and institutions like the United Nations need to reach people with the accurate information that they can trust." Misinformation is not a new phenomenon, and it's probably as old as humankind itself. But the speed at which it spreads using 21st century communications methods means the stakes for the global community have never been higher. Our guest today will provide us with some tools to help us better understand and combat this age-old problem that plagues our modern world. I'm really excited to introduce to you today Dr. David Robert Grimes, who is a scientist and author of The Irrational Ape: Why We Fall for Disinformation, Conspiracy Theory, and Propaganda, published in the UK, and in the US, Good Thinking: Why Flawed Logic Puts Us All at Risk, and How Critical Thinking Can Save the World. He writes on science and society for outlets including The Guardian, The Irish Times, Scientific American, The Atlantic, the BBC, The Financial Times, and The New York Times. He appears frequently on news media across the world to discuss topics as diverse as viral health disinformation to cancer science, and he gives talks across the world on the importance of evidence in society. He was a joint winner of the 2014 Nature Sense About Science Maddox Prize for standing up for science, and he is an elected fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. Join me, please, in welcoming Dr. Grimes. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I think I need to acquire the clicker, which is over here, so I'm going to have to leave after going that way. Prepared, but I'm evidently not. So thank you very much for that warm introduction. We're going to talk today a little bit about this topic, and I'm going to try to give you, in the next 60 minutes or so, a brief overview. It will be nowhere near comprehensive, but it's just a whistle-stop tour about what it is and how we can combat it. So I'm going to delve into this now. But before we do that, I want to talk about something positive, and this is an anniversary of something that I really would like to talk about. So at its heart, acceptance of misinformation is the failure of critical thinking. It's the failure of our faculties to correct for devious information. And we are able to overcome that. And I'd like to give you one positive story. It's over 60 years ago now. And when we talk about times when the world was most at threat of extinction by humans against humans, the Cuban Missile Crisis kind of flags up there. But while Khrushchev and Kennedy were undergoing this frantic diplomacy that you read about in the history books, what's less known is that the real drama was happening under the North Atlantic Ocean. And a submarine called the B-59, a Soviet submarine, had dived so deep that it couldn't communicate with Moscow anymore. It was being pursued by the USS Randolph, a destroyer, and 11 destroyers, and they were dropping depth charges to try and make the submarine come up. Their cooling system had failed. It was 50 degrees Celsius. They were running out of oxygen. They had high carbon dioxide. These are not situations conducive to good decision making. All right. Again, they knew something that was going on above the waves. What the Americans did not know is that the B-59 had a single 15-kiloton nuclear warhead that they could deploy at any stage. They also had the autonomy to deploy that, provided that the captain and the political officer agreed. So after 3 or 4 days of this, the captain and the political officer agreed that war had begun and they were going to take out the USS Randolph. They were going to be killed in the act themselves, but they weren't going to dishonor the Soviet Navy. But there was one man on board, this gentleman here, who was the flotilla commander. And just by happenstance and circumstance, he had an equal voting share to the rest of the team. And he said, I veto your request to engage. If we launch this warhead right now with the information we have, we guarantee a war. We do not know if a war has begun, and the balance of this, I cannot accept this proposal. Vasily Arkhipov was absolutely correct. He was an already distinguished Soviet hero. The fact that he didn't launch that warhead meant that while we might not know his name, his rationality, the fact that he took time to weigh up everything and say, these are the outcomes if we do different things, if we accept disinformation, is the reason we're all here today. History would be very different. And it wasn't until years later that the severity of this was recognized. Thomas Blankov, the director of the National Security Archives, literally said, a guy called Vasily Arkhipov saved the world. That was not the only time that happened during the Cold War. In 1983, Stanislav Petrov did something very similar, again in Moscow. And these two unsung Russian men saved the world. I'd also like to talk about when critical thinking fails, when we fail to look at something that's very, very important. In 1958, China was undergoing a massive agricultural revolution. It was trying to modernize its entire economy. And one of the things they had was the Four Pests campaign. They wanted to get rid of flies that spread disease and rats that spread disease and mosquitoes. But to that rogues gallery, they added an extra creature. Does anyone know what this is? This is a Eurasian tree sparrow, absolutely. And you might think that's a strange thing to add to the list of creatures you want to exterminate. And it is a bit strange. But in the political philosophy of a day, they were seen as animals of the bourgeois because they were eating the grain that farmers had sown without contributing to it. So there was a political animosity towards sparrows. And there was a gigantic campaign to eradicate them. They banged pots and pans so the birds were too scared to land. They shot them out of the sky. In Beijing, they mustered a force of 3 million volunteers to smash up their nests and kill them. And they were incredibly successful at this. Within a year, they'd killed 1 billion sparrows. They'd virtually made them extinct in China. But the problem was, while Mao was pushing this, his ornithologists and his experts were begging him not to do it because they felt there was good evidence this mightn't be the best decision. And they might have been right on this, because does anyone know what the chief food stuff of a sparrow is in China? Insects. And does anyone know what insect in particular they love? Locusts. Without any sparrows, the locust population exploded. And combined with the other failures in the Great Leap Forward campaign, that led to the Great Chinese Famine from 1959 onwards, which killed between 15 and 45 million people. And this is what happens when critical thought becomes an afterthought. This was someone not listening to expertise. This was someone being persuaded by an ideological bit of misinformation to make a terrible decision. So I want to put these two stories there to keep them in your head while we go through the rest, about how big the stakes can be. Good critical thinking and taking information and a good value can actually save the world, and doing it poorly, well, the consequences can be dire, and we need to avoid that. And now, I don't have to tell this audience here, you're all very informed, that most information online is incredibly dodgy. This paper in Science from a good few years ago found out that no matter what metric or subgenre you were looking at, whether it was science or politics, that unreliable or disreputable information outnumbered reliable information and was exposed to far more people. And they looked between 2006 and 2017 at 126,000 different topics and found that across the board, this was a problem. So we already know that, again, we know that misinformation is not a new problem, but the scale of it is absolutely staggering. And what effect does that have? Well, you've also heard the WHO's definition of the infodemic, where they said an infodemic is a rapid and far-reaching spread of both accurate and inaccurate information about something, and in their capacity, a disease. It's a portmanteau of information, an epidemic, as you can probably work out there. And it becomes very difficult for people to distinguish between fact and fiction. It makes them scared, it makes them apathetic, and it makes them far more likely to accept something detrimental to them. And we'll get into that in a bit. We've seen loads of examples during the pandemic. I mean, we're still going through it at the moment, but we remember 5G towers around the world being burnt down in the early days because there was a rumor going around that COVID-19 was caused by 5G. I don't think I have to tell this audience how little sense that makes, but there was over 174 arson attacks between Europe and America alone. So people really believe this. Ivermectin, we're still having people promoting this wonder drug, which is a horse deworming tablet. It doesn't work for COVID. Please don't take it. No matter what someone on Joe Rogan said, it will not work. Please don't do it. And then you have a lot of people that pivoted into this kind of very profitable COVID misinformation market, which we'll come back to in a bit. These problems existed before the pandemic. I've worked a lot on vaccine hesitancy over my career, and we have seen that before the pandemic, in 2019, the WHO declared vaccine hesitancy a top 10 threat to public health because they had outbreaks of once virtually extinct diseases suddenly started to make a resurgence. In the year 2000 in America, measles was declared measles free for the first time. And then if you see this graph going up there, we've had huge outbreaks since. In fact, we had our biggest one last year. And that is coming from communities that no longer vaccinate because they've been exposed to anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. Anti-vaccine conspiracy theories, by the way, are a great canary in a coal mine for misinformation because they've existed online for pretty much as long as we've had the internet. We will come back to them in a little bit when we talk about consequences. And by the way, one of the things about the pandemic that exposed, and I think everyone realizes this now, if you talked about conspiracy theories about health or politics years ago, you probably pictured someone with a tinfoil hat hiding in their mother's basement. And I've been saying for years to people, no, they are your brothers, your sisters, your cousins, and your mothers. I'm sure everyone here has had a family member that's believed at least one COVID conspiracy theory. And these are just to give you an idea. This is just from a few years ago. We know that about 37% of Americans believe the FDA are suppressing a cure to cancer. And they believed that before the pandemic too. These problems are huge, but they've been with us for the whole time. And we're going to see how they will get worse before they get better. And again, politics is obviously something very important to this audience. The effect of disinformation on politics, this is a New York Times article from October. We've seen splintered and polarized discourse. I'm going to talk a bit about that in a while. When the internet first came out, there was this kind of, idea it was going to be a utopia. Everyone was going to speak to each other and be exposed to new viewpoints. And there was one group at MIT in 1996 who said, no, people are going to end up in echo chambers. And they had a term for it, which we don't use often enough. They called it cyber balkanization, that it would become so fractured that it would resemble the Balkan states back in 1990. And their prophecy is probably closer to the mark than our kind of utopian view of the internet now. So it's sometimes called the echo chamber effect or the splinternet, but this is the original term from 1996, which I quite like. And we see this as well. Democrats and Republicans have become more ideologically divided than ever before. The internet allows you to become your own curator of news. You can cherry pick the articles that agree with your biases and put them out there, and you end up in an echo chamber of people who reinforce that. We choose who to follow on Twitter. We choose who we're friends with on Facebook. I don't quite understand TikTok because I'm not young enough, but the ideas exist. And you can see the polarization becoming incredibly pronounced. And this is something the Columbia Journalism Review found as well. Political polarization has increased with internet access and engagement online. We saw that during Brexit. You see the hashtags that were used about the Brexit debate. You could see that the Remain hashtags never really interacted with the Brexit ones. They were in two separate ideological chambers preaching to themselves. And this is a real problem. We all share one world. We can disagree on what we need to do with it, but if we can't even agree on basic facts, that renders us very susceptible to manipulation by demagogues and charlatans to a huge degree. Some definitional stuff to get out of the way, the very boring stuff first. I'm going to talk about misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. And there's different definitions. So I'm going to use the Council of Europe definition, being a little bit Eurocentric, but forgive me on this one. Misinformation is inadvertent propagation of a false claim. Happens all the time. For example, someone tells you, I hear carrots are really good for your eyesight. That's actually not true. It's a bit of propaganda from the Second World War, but we'll get back into that later. But it's so commonly believed they're not trying to mislead you deliberately when they tell you that. Disinformation is probably what you're all more familiar with. It's the deliberate spreading of something that is not true. And it's false information introduced to mislead. And malinformation is a weird one which you mightn't have heard of before. And I'm trying to raise awareness of malinformation in a big way. Malinformation is correct information, absolutely true, but taken out of context or used to mislead. And I try to give an example of that because it is a bit confusing. So, has anyone ever heard of dihydrogen monoxide? If you have, yeah, some of you might have. So, just to give you a few facts about dihydrogen monoxide, it kills about 1 million people a year. It's incredibly corrosive to metals. It can eat through them. It can eat through landscapes. It's found in nuclear waste, in human tumors. It's incredibly corrosive to a lot of household materials. And it's in our foodstuff to a huge degree. And even if you wash it, you cannot get it out of it. Right. So there's always motions. Should we, on the basis of what I've told you, and I think this is a fair point, there have been a few different petitions to label this or get it banned. And would that seem to you to be a reasonable thing to do? Just show of hands. Who thinks that we should probably label this stuff because it does kill people? Yeah, I think it's fair. Anyone think we shouldn't label it? So we have more labels. So dihydrogen monoxide, I should warn you, has a more common name. What does di mean? 2. Dihydrogen monoxide, H2O. The more common name for dihydrogen monoxide is water. Everything I've told you about water is true there, but I left out some vital context to make you think it was something dangerous or nebulous for your health. That is how malinformation works. I'm not lying, but I am cherry picking what I'm telling you. So the dihydrogen monoxide hoax is a really good one. You can also do it with hydrochloric acid. They're all fancy names for it. They're all water. So context is very, very important for information. So the first thing that people get confounded by, I think, is misinformation is much more effective if it seems to be logical. And we can be misled, particularly inadvertently, by bad logic. And I'm going to bring you back to the year 832 to try and give an example of this. So if you ever watched Game of Thrones, you know, the medieval papacy made Game of Thrones look like Thomas the Tank Engine. There was popes killing popes, raising armies, murdering each other. It was a great old time. And in the year 832, there was a very famous trial where one pope, Pope Stephen the Seventh or Sixth, depending on how you count your anti-popes, it was one of those times, was putting his predecessor, Pope Formosus, on trial. And he was accusing him of, you know, taking money and simony and all the fun stuff. And what Pope Formosus did was he looked at him with a stony face silence and refused to answer any of the charges. So Stephen turned to the audience and he said, "An innocent man would defend himself. He's not defending himself, therefore you must find him guilty." And they did find him guilty. They cut off 3 of the fingers on his right hand so he couldn't perform any blessings. They put him in a cell for a while, and eventually they threw him into a river. Now, in Pope Formosus' defense, he had been dead for 8 months before the trial actually began. That was why he'd been so quiet the entire time. This was called the Synod Herendia. By the way, didn't end well for Stephen. By the end of that summer, Pope Stephen had been strangled by a few of his closest friends and replaced by a new pope. Like I said, Game of Thrones is a child's story compared to the actual history of the papacy. But this is a great example. Now, obviously, Stephen was no idiot. Oh, my favorite part of his story is Formosus in Latin, if anyone speaks Latin, means handsome, which I think is very unfortunate given that 8 months post-mortem, I don't imagine he was in a particular state to be presented. But Stephen wasn't an idiot. He knew he had to mislead with the veneer of a logic. And the logic he put up there, which was false, was an innocent man would defend himself. He didn't, therefore this. A lot of misinformation is accepted because it seems to make a modicum of sense, or it has a self-reinforcing logic. For example, we know that NASA landed people on the moon in 1969. And yet around the world, between 7 and 22% of people simply do not believe this, despite the copious evidence. There are mirrors on the moon that you can actually shine a powerful enough laser on and bounce it back. And they were placed there by human hands. And we have all the records. About 400,000 people worked on the Apollo project alone, right? Again, between 6 to 20% of Americans and about a quarter of Britons don't believe this. And why is that? Well, it's something to do with this. Whenever you give them evidence, they have this interesting self-reinforcing logic. If there's a cover-up, well, of course the official reports will undermine it. So you give them an official report showing it's undermined, and somehow they concoct that into evidence that there's a cover-up. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's a very common logical gap, but people can be sucked into it. Incidentally, I've played devil's advocate with this a few times because I do this in a lot of seminars with people who are a bit science adverse. Not you, obviously, you're all very well read and educated, but I kind of point, well, if there was a conspiracy theory of 400,000 people, you can show that very quickly it would fall apart. Benjamin Franklin once said that 3 can keep a secret if 2 are dead. And when you get up to 400,000, keeping a secret gets very, very difficult. But it's more rhetoric that gets us, and we are more misled by rhetoric. And as Oscar Wilde, my countryman, said, the pure and simple truth is rarely pure and never simple. And we'll talk a bit about that now. So for one of them, I work, obviously, from cancer research is my old area, and that's where I came from. And I deal with patients an awful lot. And one very common thing I get is you kind of see this kind of stuff online, right? This is not true, by the way. Please, if anyone is, please don't just, do what you want, but don't do it for cancer. So I will hear patients say to me, okay, but look at this stuff online, and cancer cells in a Petri dish, if you give them THC, the psychoactive component in cannabis, it kills the cells. That is absolutely correct. So does water. So does bleach. So does accidentally putting them in the incubator half a degree too low than you should have. So does putting salt in them. It turns out it's very easy to kill cancer cells in a Petri dish. What it's difficult to do is kill cancer cells in a person without killing their own cells, which come from the same root, right? So as a medicine, cannabis isn't great. It's fine, but it doesn't do anything for cancer. But yet this is a very, very common thing. And it's based on that misconception. That bit of rhetoric is true. You can kill cancer cells in a dish, but you can kill them with anything. They leave that part out. Arguably malinformation in that regard as well. And the reason that gets to me, and by the way, I love this XKCD thing. When you see a claim that a common drug or vitamin kills cancer cells in a Petri dish, keep in mind, so does a handgun. Absolutely true, and do keep that in mind. One of my frustrations with this is that patients that fall victim to these narratives do an awful lot worse. This is a 2018 paper from JAM Oncology. Patients who believe they're going to get natural cures to their cancer and don't go for their conventional thing, they either delay their conventional therapy or they reject it entirely. Steve Jobs would be a classic example of that, the Apple founder, who had a treatable, survivable cancer and decided he was going to go on juicing diets because one of his gurus told him that. And by the time he realized that wasn't working, the cancer had spread to the point where it couldn't be treated and he died. Right? And that was one of the richest, most resourceful men in the world. So people can easily fall victim to this. And by the way, one of the things I get is I get a lot of people going, oh, well, there's loads of experts. I found an expert who says this, that, or the other. And that's absolutely true. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, we've seen that people's individual expertise is no longer a guarantee that they're speaking sense. I wrote about this for Scientific American a while ago. We've had a lot of fringe scientists. Joe Rogan puts them on a show all the time. I'm picking on Joe Rogan, but he's the most popular podcast in the world, and he deserves it, and he can handle it. It's fine. But these are these fringe experts who will say whatever you want to hear, and they get huge popularity. And this is a good example that consensus matters more than individual arguments from authority. And during the pandemic, we've seen that to a big way. But I would argue we've seen that before the pandemic. Has anyone ever had a head cold or something and someone told them to take vitamin C? Anyone? Yeah, you're all smiling here. Have you taken it? Yeah, you have. That actually started from a very interesting source. Does anyone here, and this audience might, I'm not sure. Does anyone know who this guy is? It's a great face, doesn't he? Just really rubbery face. This is Linus Pauling. He's the only human being to have ever won 2 Nobel Prizes on his own. One for chemistry and one in peace, right? So eminently qualified guy. Some's called the father of genetics sometimes, right? So very smart guy. But in 1966, he decided that vitamin C was going to cure every disease. He decided first it would cure the cold. He wrote a book about that in 1971. Then he wrote a book saying it was going to cure cancer. Then a book saying it would cure snakebite and AIDS. It does none of these things. It doesn't even work for the cold. I should point out, it's useless for it. Yet in America, half of all Americans take vitamin C supplementation, and they spend about $50 billion a year in it because this man, an authority, said it'll work. And in fact, in 1971, JAMA had a review of his book, which was not a pleasant one, and they said, I fear the general public are going to think that this has some merit to it. And how right they were, because here we are decades later, and people will still recommend vitamin supplementation when you don't need it. And that's kind of Linus's point. So arguments from authority are inherently a bit ropey. Expert opinion from a body, a consensus body like the UN bodies, or the WHO carries far more weight than any fringe individual. And that's something you can always do. You can bring this together with consensus opinion, which is a much more stronger indicator of reliability. But there's psychological factors too that drive us into the arms of misinformation. I'm going to talk about some of them. We do not have time today to go through all of them, but this paper is really good in Nature, Eckert et al. Just this year. So there are cognitive drivers. There are things that we lack that logic, the analytical thinking. We make those logical errors we talked about a few minutes ago. We neglect source cues or knowledge and forget to think about counter evidence. So we don't ask, okay, what's the evidence against that? We just ask, what's the evidence for it? And we're going to talk about some of these in a while. There's also socio-affective drivers. It turns out our beliefs, we like to think that we're very rational, level-headed, logical. We're not. We are social animals first. We have egos. We want to be liked. We want to fit in with groups. That has a way, way bigger effect on us than we think. If it didn't, advertising wouldn't work. In advertising, you put a product on someone who is considered desirable or you want to be like, and you will say, no, that's not why I buy that product. But advertisers have known for years that we do. And we've had there's a lot of evidence that that is unfortunately true. The very first thing I want to talk to you about is illusory truth. It's one of the things that's back here, right? Things being familiar makes them more likely to accept them. And one of the first people to realize this, I think, in the modern era was Napoleon. Napoleon took advantage of the very early days of mass printing. And theater was a big thing he took advantage of. This picture here is a bit of Napoleonistic propaganda, and it's a classic picture. We've all seen it. He made himself look great. He actually wasn't short either. That's an urban legend. He was 5'7", which was slightly above average for a man of his time. The Duke of Wellington was 5'4", so that's not true. He should have counted that one. And he said the only figure in rhetoric of serious importance is namely repetition. And he should have said repetition, repetition, repetition. And he's unfortunately correct. It turns out that really works in us. Daniel Kahneman, the author of Thinking Fast and Slow, said a reliable way to make people believe in falsehoods is frequent repetition, because familiarity is not easily distinguished from truth. And dictators throughout history and marketers have known this an awful long time. So this is the illusory truth effect. And this works even if we know something to be false. I was just saying this actually a while ago. I still say when I'm looking after my friends' kids, oh, they're hyperactive because of the sugar. Even though I know that sugar does not make children hyperactive, that's been disproved for years, I will still find myself saying it because it was said to me so often. And I have to stop and go, that's actually not true. And I'm saying this to a bunch of 5-year-olds who are confused by why I'm going back on myself. We've seen this in politics. It has huge political advantage. The Trump won, stop the steal. We all know that election was not stolen in any meaningful sense of the word. And yet, because it's been repeated so often, it's galvanized a fan base. I do like this cartoon here, Trump and Plato. But surely you agree that truth can be created by the repetition of a lie. And unfortunately, it kind of can. And that's the worrying thing. The very related to this is a thing called the availability heuristic. When we think about something, we pick up information and we go to our mental database, our file of facts, and we look up something that's similar because that's quick and easy. That's how humans think, right? And this is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of something because it's easier to access in memory. It's more frequently shaped or more emotive, or we've just heard it more. So for example, I love this cartoon, I'll Never Fly Again, because the guy's just written about 12 die in an airplane crash. He hasn't, for example, asked how many people died traveling in cars or walking. So again, the availability is a big problem. This definition list, I've just repeated it here. This actually comes from the Debunking Misinformation Handbook, which I'll talk about a bit later on. And again, this is continued influence effect. This is the reliance on inaccurate information in people's memory that even after it's been corrected, it still lingers. And this is a real problem. We are not as rational as we like to think we are a lot of the time. And the big thing where you see this, and the availability isn't just how often you've heard it, it's how emotive it is. Right? And this has put us on the back foot in health disinformation for a long time. We've seen this with the anti-vaccine movement for years. All of their rhetoric, even though after clean water, there is nothing more life-saving in human history than vaccination. Anti-vaccine propaganda is not a new thing, by the way. That's a cartoon from 1908. That one is from 1898. It goes back a long time. It's the same nonsense, different day, right? Same old crap. And that's from like last year. They're not even creative. I think the biggest sin is they're not even original. I wish they just came up with something new and I wasn't just debunking things that literally I have from the 1700s, because that's when they started this and they haven't finished. But what they do, which is hugely advantageous for them, is that they can scare people, because that sticks in your memory more. If I tell you, oh, if you get your children vaccinated, it's going to put them in wheelchairs, that's absolute nonsense. However, that's scary. And that's going to stick in your memory over me giving you a bunch of statistics about how life-saving this might be. And we'll come back to how we message that later on, because actually putting a human spin on that and putting a human face on it, saying, for example, when I talk about measles vaccination, I tend to talk about how many millions of children's lives were saved last year because of vaccination. And it's usually about 1 million a year. And yeah, that is that number can get lost in the ether if you're not careful. That's the headline figure, but people will try to focus on fictitious, scary stories because they'll hit you here and you remember them, right? Again, we all are aspirational figures. We have socio-affective drivers of whether we accept misinformation. If Oprah says it on her show, we're far more likely to believe it. There's one estimate that thinks that Oprah's endorsement of Barack Obama gained him about 1 million votes in the primaries, which is fascinating, right? Unfortunately, Oprah has a bit of a penchant for putting people like Dr. Oz on her show, who are mass drivers of medical misinformation. In Oz's case, it's not ideological. He makes a fair bit of money out of it, and we'll talk about that as well. And obviously, Gwyneth Paltrow here has a lifestyle brand called Goop, where she sells things like vaginal eggs, which are eggs you're supposed to put in your vagina to give you more chi and energy. There's about $85 a piece. Gynecologists do not recommend that you put rocks in your vagina. I'm putting it out there. And yet, because she is a very popular figure, her company brings in about $1 billion a year, even though most medical professionals would start crying if you actually go through what this is. It's a bigger driver. We care more about what the desirable celebrity is doing than we'd like to admit, right? And again, that goes for fringe figures too. Look, I'm picking on Joe Rogan again. Take that. So during the pandemic, we had people like Russell Brand, a light entertainment celebrity in the UK, become a conspiracy theorist with a huge channel. We've had Alex Jones recently have record figures awarded against him, and rightfully so, for spreading plenty of misinformation, but in this case, misinformation about the Sandy Hook's family. If you aren't familiar with that case, it was the murder of 26 children in a school shooting in America, which Alex Jones claimed was staged, and all the parents were faking it because they were actors. And that led to a bunch of lunatics coming to their hometown and pulling up children's gravestones and all kinds of stuff like that. Absolutely horrific stuff. And Jones has now claimed that he was just playing a character, and this was performance art. His InfoWars shows is hugely. All these people sell supplements as well. I think that's a very important thing. It may be an ideological motivation for them to spread misinformation, but they certainly have a profit margin on that too. 64 million is what Alex Jones made last year in supplements. And I have no idea what Joe Rogan makes, but I know Spotify bought him for 100 million, and he also sells supplements. So, but one of the reasons, why do people accept this? I mean, if you're given alternative explanations for something, what makes you more likely to accept this? And I go back to the X-Files. I watched that when I was a kid. Anyone watch that as well? And Fox Mulder had that poster, I want to believe. I had that poster too. Then I became a scientist, and unfortunately I realized I'd like to believe, but the evidence doesn't support that hypothesis, so I don't. Is usually what I say, especially that is really bad around kids at Christmas with Santa. I don't bring it up. The evidence doesn't support that one. But a guy who studied this was Leon Festinger, and he has this quote here which I love. He said, "A man with a conviction is a hard man to change. Tell him you disagree and he turns away. Show him facts or figures and he questions your sources. Appeal to logic and he fails to see your point." Paul Simon said, "All lies in jest, still the man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest," right? So we're all familiar with this. If you've ever sat down over a Thanksgiving dinner or a Christmas dinner with a family member who's a conspiracy theorist, you've had these conversations too, okay? But the way he understood this, he was a bit different because he was a psychologist who studied cults. And back in the 1950s, there was an American cult that thought the world was going to end on December 21st, 1954 in Chicago. And in a day when student ethics were slightly different, he sent his PhD students to go and live with them. He could not do that these days. The world did not end on the 21st of December, 1954, right? But what was interesting is you would think that would disabuse them of their notion. But no, it actually made them more committed believers. They suddenly started believing that they had saved the world through their faith. They're called the Seekers. They still exist. And this happens quite a bit. They become more evangelist of their beliefs. This is why it can be very hard to disprove someone. If you are motivated if you really want to believe something, you can often bend evidence that way. And this is kind of where we choose our battles a little bit, but we can talk a bit about that in a few minutes. A big case study in this, by the way, is climate disinformation. We have probably the most pressing problem we have, if it's not geopolitics, is climate change. And we still have a huge amount of pushback on even accepting the reality of anthropogenic climate change. And partly that's ideological. If you're a free market libertarian in the States, you are far more likely to reject climate change. And the reason for that is you have a political philosophy. You're a libertarian and you believe in the free market. Someone says, hey, you're pumping out fossil fuels is ideologically equivalent to trespass. And you have to suddenly either refine the boundaries of your philosophy, which is cognitively expensive, it's hard to do, it requires a lot of reflective thought, or you can just deny there's a problem. So ideologically, if you are a big libertarian, you're far more likely to reject climate change. And that goes with extreme conservatism as well. Equally, we know the fossil fuel industry have pumped an awful lot of money into spreading those narratives. Because if people have muddied waters, they go, oh, well, the science is out on it. The science is not out on it. The science has not been out on it. It was Joseph Fourier in France in the late 1700s hypothesized the reality of climate change, and it was an Irish scientist in 1854 who first showed we were doing it. So we've known for a long time that this is happening. So the science is out, it is not out, and we know this. But there's a reason for pushing this, both ideological and financial. And that actually has a nice history, a horrible history, I should say. We've known since the 1930s that cigarette smoking causes cancer. 1933, to be specific, right? And in the 1960s, the American cigarettes companies spent a fortune on PR companies to spread doubt. And this is a declassified memo, which you should definitely read. It's interesting. And it was called Doubt is Our Product. And they said it's the best way to introduce controversy in the public mind. And this is a memo from 1961 that was eventually leaked. And it's absolutely fascinating because it's a horrible idea, but it worked very well for them. As long as they could muddy the scientific consensus on what caused cancer, they could keep selling cigarettes to the public. And it's interesting now that we see fossil fuel companies doing very similar things. Again, there's another thing that I have alluded to, and this goes down to the spectrum of belief, conspiratorial ideation. And this is a real problem. This is the tendency of individuals to believe that everything is controlled by a secret cabal, right? Even when other evidence would be much better, even when you disprove it, this is a belief they prefer. And that can be very difficult. Some of you have dealt with this. About a quarter of the population have a tendency towards it. And again, there's a few reasons for this. This is from a paper I did a good while ago. So you can nudge people down the spectrum of accepting science and medicine or not, or towards the conspiratorial end, right? Things that will make them more likely to accept science and medicine is if it increases their understanding, if they get a better sense of well-being from understanding that, if they get a sense of control from it. So if you understand more, you have a better sense of control. And if trusted experts, or expert bodies, I should also point out there, intervene, things that nudge them towards rejecting illusory truth. So all that anti-vaccine, anti-COVID vaccine propaganda is going to nudge them down the spectrum. We often hear people say pro-vax, anti-vax. It's actually a spectrum. It's not a binary. And that is good for us because we can nudge people as well. Availability heuristic, if the information is out there, and anecdotal vividness. So if the stories are scary enough, they nudge people towards this. Why do people believe in them? Epistemic certainty is a big thing. Conspiracy theories and a lot of misinformation gives you the feeling you understand what's going on, that you have knowledge of it. And that's very pleasurable to some people. Thinking you know is better than knowing you don't know for a lot of people. Aversion to randomness as well. A lot of people really dislike the idea that things happen by chance, that things aren't planned. They would prefer to believe that Bill Gates or George Soros engineered a pandemic than accept the reality that viruses can evolve and mingle and change and become that dangerous. And weirdly enough, that's a more comforting belief to them. It doesn't sound comforting to me to believe there's a puppet master pulling the strings, but it is to some people. And finally, egotism. People who perpetuate conspiracy theories often tend to score much higher on narcissistic traits. I'm thinking of Russell Brand in my head here, but you can conjure up your own images. People who like the attention. They may not even be profiting from it, but they like feeling like they're an expert, even if they don't have any of the criteria to be considered one. What do these two people have in common, by the way, just to show you this? The first one, everyone know who this is? Diana, Princess of Wales. How about this? Can we say Osama bin Laden inside a UN building? I don't know. We're going to, right? These two people are the subject of a huge amount of conspiracy theories. And they're actually the same conspiracy theory, but slightly changed. In Diana's case, it's the belief that she either faked her own death or the Queen had her murdered. And in Osama bin Laden, it's that his death was faked, or that he was a government patsy working the whole time, or a CIA agent. These are really popular beliefs. And a friend of mine in the UK who studies people with conspiratorial beliefs took them in to analyze people that believe this. And they gave them narratives. The American cohort got the Osama bin Laden narratives about whether he was alive or dead and who he'd worked for. And the UK one got Diana is alive and Diana is dead. And amazingly, people could believe both of these narratives at the same time. Like there was some kind of Schrodinger's bin Laden who's walking around in an alive and dead state, or a princess that's half a steering wheel somewhere and somewhere else, right? And she wrote a paper which I love, and it's called Dead and Alive, Beliefs in Contradictory Conspiracy Theories. And this is insane. People can hold to absolutely exclusive beliefs as long as they feel they know something that you don't. It appeals to that sense of well-being. They understand it and you don't. And that's very hard to reason with, right? The other one I've heard a lot during the pandemic is COVID is a hoax, but it's caused by 5G, and you can cure it with ivermectin. All of these are mutually, these come from the same people, I should point out, all the time. They are not, and you have to realize they are not looking for a consistent worldview that is airtight and makes sense like science might, like step on step. They're looking for a feeling they know something. And that they know a cover up is going on. That actually is a rewarding feeling for a lot of people. So just to be aware of that when you are for crafting messages, it's important to know this is not the cohort you're probably going to be able to reach. So don't put all your weapons there. I'm going to skip through this one fairly quick just because I'm aware of time. But we are also misled innocently and not so innocently by the fact that we're all really bad at numbers, right? Our literacy is poor, but our numerical literacy is shocking. I give this one to my students. It's an old graph, right? And I ask them, what's going on here? Cancer cases go up year on year on year. Back in the 1970s, you had a 1 in 3 chance of having cancer in your lifetime. Now it's 1 in 2. So what's going on? Does anyone have any ideas what might be happening here? Is the world becoming more dangerous? You have an idea. This gentleman is correct. Everyone has to die. The reason we have more cancer is that we have less of this. I was about to say we have less people dying of infectious disease. So let's pretend COVID didn't happen and just go there. But in general, we do. We have vaccines that prevent childhood deaths that used to bring our statistics way down. If you live long enough, cancer is primarily a disease of aging. If you roll the genetic dice through someone's life, you will eventually acquire enough mutations to get a cancer. So perversely, increased cancer rates are a symptom of increased societal health. We are living longer and healthier lives, and therefore all of this is not as big a factor. And sometimes that's why I always say vaccines are often, in particular, a victim of their own success. You don't see all the lives that didn't die, that would have died otherwise, but didn't for vaccination. So they become a victim of their own success. People go, I think in The Simpsons, there's a line where Homer says, why are we vaccinating the children against diseases they don't even have? Which obviously the Simpsons writers knew was a joke, but unfortunately, I think a lot of the general population don't. Another thing to get into numbers, why we're bad at them, we're also bad at asking about the converse of evidence, for counter evidence, right? So we talked about the availability heuristic, where we look for what's available, but what about the opposite of availability? In World War II, there was an Office of Naval Services that had to look at the kind of statistics of damaged flights coming back from the Pacific Theater. These were dogfights in the air in the old days between Japanese and American forces. And they came back and they started trying to work out where the damage was distributed over their aircraft, to work out where they could probably get the margins and reinforce it. And this is the graph they had, okay? So they had bullet holes in the wings and here and here and here. And originally the engineers said, okay, what we'll do is we'll reinforce these areas. And it wasn't until a statistician called Abraham Vald said, you know the reason the crafts that get hit here, here, and here don't come back, right? They're not coming back. They're being blown up. The only data the Americans had was the surviving crafts. They had survivorship bias. They had lost the evidence of the craft that blew up. The place to reinforce, by the way, was the cockpit and the engines, which, as you can see here, have very little damage. Because if you get shot there, you don't come back to be analyzed. And we do this all the time. We do this with anecdotal data all the time. We hear about the lottery winner or the person that dropped out of college and became a millionaire CEO. We don't hear about the millions of other people who dropped out of college and just dropped out of college. XKCD, again, I have to attribute them, have this great one about never stop buying lottery tickets, no matter what anyone tells you. I failed again and again, but never gave up. I took extra jobs, poured the money into tickets, and here I am, proof that you put in the time, it pays off. Every inspirational speech by someone successful should have to start with a disclaimer about survivorship bias. And I fully agree with this. When you hear anecdotes of people's stories, this is often the problem. You need to dig into it. I'm going to give you one more in numbers, and I'm going to skip on numbers a little bit, just to show you how easily misled we are. The Western inkblot ELISA test for HIV is 99.99% accurate. It is a really good test. Excellent test, right? Now, most of you are low risk. You don't look at your IV drug users. You look a bit dodgy. No, I jest. You look at, and generally you're all low risk, right? You're here in the UN. No, you're. I don't think they allow IV drugs here, as far as I know. So you go in to get tested, and the doctor says, "I'm sorry, the test came back positive." What do you think the probability of you having HIV is? Who thinks it's high? 99.99% accurate test, and you're told you have it. Hands up for high. One person, two, three, and hands up for low. Whoa. You're getting suspicious. You're just guessing here. Hands up for exactly average, 50-50. It's 50-50. Now, let me explain that, because it's weird. What I didn't tell you is how probable it is that you, as low-risk people, and that's the reason I asked that question, are going to have HIV. The odds are about 1 in 10,000 for low-risk populations around here, okay? So imagine 10,000 people going to get tested, and it's easier to see with a frequency tree, I always think. We're bad at numbers, we're bad at Bayes' theorem, but we're really good at pictures. 10,000 going to get tested, one unfortunate individual has it, they will flag positive, so you got one positive test. But in the remaining 9,999, you're also going to get one positive test, because the test is really good. It's 99.99% accurate, but it ain't perfect, no test is. You now have 2 positive results, only one of which is a true positive. 1 over 2 is 50%. If that's confusing to you, don't worry. That's very confusing to medical doctors too. They usually get it wrong when they have to convey it to people. And this is why when we recommend to them, if you're going to communicate numbers like this, it's easier to show pictures and make sense out of it. There is a mathematical way, some of you will know, called Bayes' theorem, where you're supposed to crunch these numbers. You should not do it. In the early days of the AIDS crisis, when we first had these tests, there was patients told to go home and prepare to die. You have HIV. And then when they found themselves alive 5 years later, after having sold all their possessions, they had to go back, and a very sheepish doctor had to say, yeah, I don't understand how testing works. So that's a bit of a problem. The vaccine stuff, it happens as well. We heard a big figure from the UK a few years ago, or from last year, this time last year, and I put it up because I thought it was interesting, was that they said 2/3 of deaths were in people over 50 who were vaccinated. And the anti-vaccine movement went mad with this, going, see? But the missing bit of information there was how many people over 50 are vaccinated. It was 95%, right? So 2/3 of a death were occurring in 95%. The converse of that meant that 1/3 of deaths were being caused by just 5% of people. And when you crank through the numbers, it was 20 times more likely that you would die from COVID not having been vaccinated as having been vaccinated. That's how we can be misled by statistics in isolation. And again, information is never neutral. It's never put out there. It's always got a spin on it that you have to be aware of. Oh, what happens here? So we are kind of engines of outrage. The biggest single predictor of whether we share information online or not is if it makes us angry, if it makes us disgusted. And the people that spread disinformation are fully aware of this. If something makes you really, really annoyed or furious, it's really worth stopping and checking it, because it's often engineered to do that way. Clickbait, we're all familiar with, is engineered to get a rapid response. And it does. We very much do it. But there's often reasons that disinformation is spread. And I kind of love I don't love the Cold War period, but I love the history of the Cold War period, because there was a ridiculous spy versus spy game going on. If we're getting a bit of deja vu now, unfortunately, we might be. But one of these ones I thought was fascinating was in the early days of the AIDS crisis. There was a newspaper article that came out originally in India saying that AIDS was a man-made disease that had been invented by the US to control undesirable populations and had got out of control, right? And then there was other things coming out of this. There was a guy called Jacob Siegel, who was a biochemist, again, fringe expert, who put this out there. AIDS is not a man-made virus. It's a horrific thing. But it turns out this was a bit of Soviet disinformation. And they had 2 reasons for doing this. Firstly, the KGB put this out. It's called Operation Infection. They eventually apologized for it, but I'll explain why they apologized, not for the best reasons. They put it out there because, A, it would cause discontent in America. The Reagan administration was absolutely dreadful during the AIDS crisis. It absolutely ignored its most vulnerable citizens. And they thought they could take political capital with that, which is a fair reason to do it. They also had their own bioweapons program they didn't want anyone knowing about, so they figured if they could point the finger at America, which in this one case actually wasn't running a bioweapons program, that it would be a good distraction. The problem was AIDS is very, very real. And 3 years later, AIDS came to Russia in a big way. And Russia had to go to America to get the help of the virologists. And one of the backdoor negotiations was that they would get free help with AIDS as long as they dropped this goddamn campaign. And they ended up apologizing for it after the fall of the USSR in 1991. But unfortunately, that leaves a mark. There's still huge places in the world where this, the idea that AIDS is man-made has caused severe harm. So there's always a consequence associated with this. We have to be very careful. People will do things for political capital one day that will have ramifications years on at the most vulnerable. We have to be very aware that you share, act in haste, repent in leisure. So how can we combat this? I'm going to finish up this last section, and then hopefully we'll have a chat about this, and we'll see where we can go with it, right? There's different things. I love Feynman's quote on this. Science is a way of trying not to fool yourself. The first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. And if we always keep that in mind, it does make life a bit easier. UNICEF have a model which is called the debunking model, and I really like this one. When your organizations and your countries and everything else, when you have to challenge misinformation, how do you do it without reinforcing that misinformation? Well, it turns out you can lead with the fact. So if someone says, I will do an example in a second, the next thing is you point out whether this is misinformation or deliberate disinformation, but you do that briefly because you don't want to give too much airtime to the fiction that you have to debunk. Then you point out if it's unintentional, if it's a bit of misinformation and where it came from, because that's interesting to people usually, or if it's intentional, and then you flag the tactics. And then you provide the fact again. You make a fact sandwich. Lead with the fact, deal with the disinformation, and put a fact at the end. Example here, I heard the COVID-19 vaccine gives you COVID. That was a really common one years ago. How do we apply this model here? First thing, fact, the COVID-19 vaccine will not make you sick with COVID-19. Lead with the fact. Then you say, well, this is actually misinformation. That's your warning. Fallacy, some people are saying it's not true. You might feel sick after getting the vaccine, but that's actually a sign that your body is responding and creating antibodies. And then you say again, the COVID-19 vaccine does not cause COVID-19. It teaches your immune system to deal with it. And you can apply this model to most things. I also like to use the Socratic method, right? So for example, in my cancer field, there's a big thing about this being a secret cure for cancer. There is not, unfortunately, a secret cure for cancer, but it's very common. People like Joe Mercola, one of a disinformation dozen, which you might have read about in the New York Times, the 12 people that spread the most disinformation about COVID and made the most money from it. He's the guy who runs a thing called Mercola.com. They sell all natural products, allegedly, and he makes about 100 million doing this. So it's a profitable spin, a grift. And then you have people like this who have their own interest in doing it. This is not true, but these are common claims. So let's apply a Socratic method if you're dealing with people. And this is to ask questions and to answer them in a kind of challenging way. So firstly, let's take the first premise that there's a secret cure for cancer. Well, the first thing is cancer one disease? No. Cancer is over 210 known maladies, all with very different treatments and approaches. Some of them respond to radiotherapy, some to chemo, some to immunotherapy, and some to nothing. They're all very different and they originate from patients themselves in different cells. There's no reason to think there'd be a single magic bullet for cancer. So the first thing is we can then, all you're doing is giving people the tools to plant their own seeds, to plant their own seeds of doubt about things that are wrong. You're not necessarily telling them you're wrong, but you're saying, okay, let's accept what you've said and break down it level by level. You're engineering a little bit of doubt sometimes without calling someone an idiot or just saying you're wrong, because that shuts things down. You're inviting them to think more about their precepts, and I'll show you this in a second. The second one, they go, well, a cure wouldn't be profitable. Big Pharma wouldn't want a cure because they'd never make money. Well, firstly, any disease that affects half of the Western world is going to make you a lot of money, even if you sell it for peanuts. But then you also point out that, well, actually, that's what they do all the time. Pharmaceutical companies go out and they bioprospect and they find different chemicals in nature and then they patent them. They do it all the time. If we found out vitamin D cured cancer tomorrow, different pharmaceutical companies would be rushing to find out the ideal dose, the exact active molecule, and then they'd be selling it in different formulations to you. So absolutely, that's what they do all the time. So that's not true. And the final one I get is this. But cancer rates are going up. They go back to the other bit because they're being manipulated by big pharma. This is really common. I wish this wasn't. But again, 37% of Americans believe the FDA are hiding a cure for cancer. I need to remove that. Does anyone read Ancient Egyptian? No, don't worry. This is an ancient thing describing the removal of a breast tumor. And that was written by Imhotep, the architect and physician, and also the bad guy in the original Mummy for some reason. I don't know why they picked his name, but if you watch the Brendan Fraser one, they do call him Imhotep, and I have no idea why, because he was actually quite a brilliant person. Also, cancer itself, named in ancient Greek times, that's why I stuck this out, Apparently, if you let a skin tumor grow too long, it starts looking like the legs of a crab trying to escape your face. That's why it's called cancer, because back in the day, they didn't know anything. We don't allow that happen anymore. Don't worry. You'll never see that now. But if you ever wondered why it's called cancer and like the zodiac sign, that's why. So cancer is a very old disease. And again, we're living longer. So you're not necessarily saying people are wrong, but you're saying, well, examine the precepts. All you're doing is giving people the tools to change their own mind and an alternative explanation that will make them question themselves. You will never change anyone else's mind, and they'll never change yours, but you can give people the tools to go and do it themselves. Right? No one has ever changed your mind in your life. You've changed it yourself. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. I won't, in interest of time, I'll skip this, but the Wuhan lab leak stuff is the exact same. People put it out there going, oh, this could have happened. But then if you look at every precept of it, it's far more likely on a balance of probability that this is just a naturally evolving virus like they happen. I won't go through the whole steps in that one. I've already said the Feynman quote. Again, the final thing with tackling it is a good idea. If the myth is largely unknown, it's probably not worth tackling it because you might actually make it better known. And this is a balance if you have a bigger platform or if your organization has a big platform. Sometimes the best thing to do with misinformation is roll your eyes and go, no. But monitor it. Check if it's growing legs. Because sometimes if you jump in and counter it when it's too small, you'll end up amplifying it. The other thing to do is if it has traction, you can debunk and we can go through this fact sandwich again, right? But sometimes the best thing to do is nothing. Sometimes you do have to take things. This is from the Debunking Handbook 2020. It's free online. A friend of mine is one of the co-authors. It's absolutely brilliant, and I highly advise everyone to pick up a copy of it. So again, just to recap, what makes people susceptible to misinformation? Failures of logic, being misled by rhetoric, our own psychological biases and ideological ones, they're huge factors. The fact that we're bad at numbers, the fact that we are terrible at identifying reliable sources, and that's a whole talk in itself. And finally, that we don't always know the basic precepts of science. That slide is really aged, given that Breaking Bad has been off the air for years, but I'm still leaving it in there. And finally, debunking and pre-bunking, both of these work. If you know some bit of misinformation is going to affect your cause, you can get out there ahead of it. And we actually have good information that works a hell of a lot better. I'll show you how. We know from a paper that just came out this year that you can teach people, you can psychologically inoculate people against misinformation or particular tropes of it. And if they're forewarned, they're forearmed, and they're far less likely to fall for it. It is easier to stop a house going on fire than it is to put out a house fire. And it's the exact same with misinformation. If you know it's coming, and if you know what people are going to do, you can preempt it. And the good example of this came from the beginning of the year when the Ukrainian invasion began. The US did something very unusual. They published every one of their documents on disinformation campaigns, which were supposed to engineer an idea that Ukrainian militants were going to attack Russia. That was not true. And the fact that the Biden administration published that was unprecedented, but a very effective way of pre-bunking it. It didn't stop what happened, but it made a global effort. It didn't muddy the waters like people didn't know what to believe. There was a global effort and it became very clear, and that's probably the divide we see now. I'll skip over this, but again, there's system level corrections you can do, and that could be legislation and punishment for bad actors, but on an individual level, pre-bunking and inoculation and debunking and accuracy timestamps are really, really important. Epilogue, I just want to say this finally. There is no shame in people changing their minds, us changing our minds. The only shame is in refusing to do so when the evidence demands it. Our views should be fluid, and what we believe should update as things go on. We are not our ideas. Psychologically, we feel we are, but our ideas should be discarded when they are wrong and changed. And they should be changed often. We're usually wrong. Our position should be flexible as much as anyone we're trying to convince. Dialogue is far more useful than debate. If you can have a conversation with people, you are far more to change their mind. We never change anyone's mind. We're just giving them the tools to do so. People don't do that when you call them an idiot and challenge them. But you also have to pick your audience too. Anyway, I've ranted enough at you and we're going to stop and hopefully, if you want to know more about that, you can contact me online. And I've written a lot of this stuff as well anytime. But thank you very much for listening, and we'll chat now. So thank you for your patience.
Excellent, everyone. We have some time for questions. If there are any questions in the audience, you can go ahead and raise your hand and activate your mic. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That was brilliant. I just love this topic, this information. From your expertise, do you see any intersections between gender and disinformation, or have you done any case studies on that topic particular?
So that's a really, really good question, and a really broad question, but a really good one. You do see it. You've seen a little bit in the Roe versus Wade stuff in the States, and in the Irish abortion debate that came up as well. But I'd be wary of answering that globally because it's such a broad scope. It definitely is going to be a factor. Anything that has an ideological issue, and unfortunately, gender-based discrimination is very much an ideological issue in a lot of places. That's going to be fuel to disinformation fire. But I'm just wary about getting too specific because actually I'm generalizing. But you're absolutely correct. It would anything that can be ideologically or financially driven or will be a fracture point. And again, disinformation often pivots on fracture points. If you can get in, if you want to cause, say, tension in a rival nation, you will find their fracture points. You will find where they're having societal fractures. And if that is gender-based, I mean, you go from Iran or America with the Roe versus Wade stuff right now, that's something where you might try to concentrate disinformation if you're a bad actor. So it's worthwhile being aware of that for sure.
We have two questions, Todd, and then we'll go to the show.
Thank you so much. This has been a fascinating workshop. What about deep fakes? I'm seeing more and more of these, and it's really unsettling. And I just wanted to get your take on how do we approach those?
So that is, you know, I was just thinking that myself earlier on because some of them are really convincing. Like and they will get to the point that they will have two functions that is negative that I see. Firstly, they will sometimes convince people of negative things about someone that they do not deserve to have be impugned with, and that's really bad. But they'll have a bigger impact, I think, is they'll make us more distrustful as a society. That we mightn't trust very clear evidence because we just roll our eyes and go, that's a deep fake, right? It's very easy to then deny actual evidence. I guess what really, the long-term solution to that problem is that we're going to have to become much more critical thinkers, and we're going to have a policy of information hygiene. And I think early in the pandemic, we saw a physical version of this. Information is every bit as infectious as any pathogen. I mean, viral propaganda is well named because it infects us and then we infect others with it. So I think it's much easier, again, to prevent people getting infected with that and to know what questions to ask because otherwise we're on the back foot trying to correct. And information hygiene is essentially the PPE version for information. That before I accept information, I go, okay, where did you get that? If a deep fake's being spread, you might go, is that the New York Times or your racist uncle's Facebook page? And again, asking about the source is often a very big critic to analyze that. But there's no substitute long-term, I don't think, for teaching us how to be a little bit more careful, to maybe reflect before we react. We are emotive creatures. We want to jump to a conclusion, but sometimes reserving judgment and going, I'd like to see where you got that from, and I'd like to see that supported by a third-party source before I accept it. It might make us a bit slower. It might not jive with the 24-hour media news cycle, but I think it'll make us healthier, happier, and a hell of a lot safer.
We had a question here, the gentleman.
David, this is an incredible talk. I'm glad I missed all the other opportunities for today to be here for this. This is a science policy conference for the CTBTO, and I don't think anyone can say that nuclear war isn't a little scary, but are we missing some opportunity to put fear into the hearts of the world for everybody to come on board for non-proliferation and nuclear testing? Not because we're doing it by the science, not by the policy. We don't inject fear. We just show people the facts, and then they have to decide whether those facts are their facts or not. I'd just like to hear your opinion on that.
It's an interesting.
More emotion and, not fewer facts, but certainly more emotion, more fear.
No, I don't think, I agree. I agree with you in one way, and I'll tell you, I think fear is the wrong word here. I think you have to humanize the subject. And one of the most effective things I've seen done with this is in vaccination programs. When you're dealing, and I will tie this back in, but I think it's an excellent question because if you can show the human cost of something, that's what people care about, right? If you are talking about why we don't want a proliferation of nuclear warheads, you can start measuring the amounts of deaths that a nuclear conflict would lead to. You're not scaremongering in that case. You're saying, look, we are desperately striving to avoid this. If this happened, this would happen. You'd have to caveat it with facts. I mean, we couldn't ever engineer a situation where we're making things up. That wouldn't be acceptable. But I mean, with vaccine stuff, I have occasionally said, look, here's how many people would have died last year if we didn't have this policy. I said, and that number scares me. If we took this out, that's what we'd be looking at next year. So I think that's absolutely acceptable. It's about doing it in such a way that you don't cloud your own message as well. But when I say, I think it's really important to realize that people aren't machines. We obviously react to emotional situations far more than we're going to react to dry statistics. That is why we've always been on the back foot with disinformation. Disinformation tends to be emotive. It tends to be angry. It tends to make us scared, angry, or distrustful. Again, because you're speaking with the gravitas of a respected, organization, and you have that group consensus, I think you can say, look, this is one of the reasons we do this, because this would be the consequences of this happening, and we want to avoid that. I don't think that's scaremongering. I don't think that's necessarily using fear. That's still using science, but just tying it more to something that people will definitely recognize because they don't want to die. Most people very against the whole dying thing. So if we can tie things to that, I think it's always good messaging.
Yes, we have a question there.
Hi, it's a pleasure, actually. It was an amazing talk. I want to ask you about what do you think is the impact of social media and the science facts, like the true science facts nowadays? Is it like improving, or do you think in the past it was easier to close it in a way? And what do you think is, why isn't there any like worthy people to talk about like real facts in social media?
That's a really good question, and I'm going to try to unpack it because there's 3 parts to that, right? Has social media? If I could go back in time and ban social media, I would, but that's a bit draconian. I prefer to train. All the problems we've talked about have existed since humans first started gossiping around water coolers, or whatever equivalent we had back when we first started agriculture, or we've always been susceptible to misinformation. All the logical stuff and fallacies I've talked about there's a reason I stuck one from 832 in, just to show we're not much more logical a millennia and a bit on. They're human flaws. So there's no shortcut for us learning to be more discriminating with our acceptance of information, or more careful about that. Social media has just taken those flaws and really exposed them. Because now, years ago, if I went down, I'm very Irish, going to use pub as an example. If I went down with a particularly stupid opinion to my friends in a pub and said, I think that the world is flat, there would immediately be 5 of my friends explaining why I'm an idiot in gross detail, having a laugh at me and making me buy the next round of drinks, right, for that. What happens now is I can go on social media and find the Flat Earth Society, who, by the way, once tweeted that they had members all over the globe, which I cannot tell whether they were being intentionally doing that as a parody, but it's brilliant. I can find any kind of weird subculture, weird beliefs I have, and then they amplify each other. Social media could be great, and this goes back to our utopian versus cyberbulk, but actually what happens is we create walled gardens. We create gardens where I'm only following people like me on social media, or I'm only following, and we all do it a little bit because we like that. We don't like people who make us angry about stuff, unless they're the enemy. Like, we don't like them when they're one of our friends, so we become very polarized, and that's what we're seeing. We're also seeing with that a kind of failure with media literacy. We've never had great media literacy. And newspapers and TVs and radios have all their problems, but there's usually some kind of editorial code. If I write a piece that's analysis, it goes in the analysis section. If it's opinion, it's in the opinion section. If it's fiction, it's in whatever the hell that is, right? Unfortunately, because we've become curators of our own media, we will cherry pick the sources that buttress the picture we want to tell the world about what we believe. So the failings of social media are in a big way the failings of people. We'll also point out that social media companies are damn well aware that outrage drives revenue. They love it. This is why even when Facebook's internal research found they could absolutely clamp down on misinformation, but those communities were the most engaged communities, they didn't want to get rid of that sweet dollar, so they didn't. You can't, I mean, I would say, and I've written in the papers, I would love on some kind of European level for social media companies to be regulated and treated like publishers, because I don't think a single country can do it. I think you'd need literally a supranational structure to do that, because these companies are so big. But they profiteer off that. And why aren't, there's the last part of your question, why aren't there people, there are people communicating well, but the truth is that outrage sells. It's much easier for you to do a Joe Rogan than it is to do a Neil deGrasse Tyson, you know? You can go out there and say, I don't believe this crazy thing I just read, what do you think? And people, I mean, I don't, that went a bit more Trump than Joe Rogan, but they both do something similar. You don't have to be constrained by facts. And if you're not constrained by facts, if you're playing in that game where facts no longer matter to you and don't really matter to your audience as much, you can get way more traction. And we've seen this with corrective narratives. We've seen that, again, with that paper I put at the beginning of the talk, that falsehoods travel much further and much further, and they get polarized into their own echo chambers, but they still infect other ones as well. And unfortunately, it is because we don't have any human immunity to deal with. There should be part of our brains where we go, no, this is obviously nonsense. I'm not accepting that. But unfortunately, we haven't learned that as a collective humanity yet. So I don't know what the solution is. It's pretty grim. But yeah, it does annoy me an awful lot of the time.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. If anyone has, I mean, I think it's a fascinating talk. I could talk to you here all day. Especially about the part of, you know, I think as members of the international community, we do have to deal with, very particularly with conspiracy theories, that there is a cabal of people who are pulling the strings. And there are many people who, you know, when the COVID pandemic started, said, oh, but WHO is doing this or they're doing that, or, you know, it's all part of this UN-backed conspiracy for this or that. And so those are things that we all, you know, that we have to deal with all the time, because sometimes for some communities, the very fact that we are putting out information is evidence of the fact that it's
You must be part of it. Yeah,
that you must be part of this conspiracy theory. So we're, you know, it's a challenge for us. And who can compete with Gwyneth Paltrow? And yeah, I mean, it's very difficult.
No one at the 97 Oscars, apparently. That was.
Yes. So we are, you know, constantly trying to, you know, share information to have an impact, but it's a very fractured and very crowded sort of, you know, town square that we're now dealing with. And as you said, there are bad actors who can monetize misinformation and disinformation. And I think we're up against that. So there's lots of challenges that we're facing. This is incredibly important to our work and communicating with people on issues that really matter, and that are of global importance. So I cannot thank you enough for coming here today to talk to us about this and the resources that you provided. And it was fantastic. And thank you so much. Please join me in giving
Thank you very
David
much.
Robert Grimes a round of applause for his time.
Thanks very much for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. It's our session. Be here for a few minutes if anyone had any questions or wanted to